So we collaborated and thought about what our focus should be, and we came up with the subtopic race, gender, citizenship, and civil discourse. And so we will go through, treat these things in our discussion today. Notice the phrase at the bottom, we teach, therefore we speak. We don't, those of us who teach, we may not really think about the fact that we're actually giving these little speeches all the time, right? So I want you to realize that even as a classroom teacher, especially those of us who, are doing lectures for upper division classes, or some of you may be teaching in junior college settings as well, or upper division classes, AP classes, you are accustomed to putting together lectures where you are standing and delivering. So a lot of what we'll talk about, you'll be able to share in with. So as she's mentioned, I am, I'm not sure if this was in my bio, but I'm actually a native Houstonian. I spent most of my life doing work in the Houston area. I started out as a language teacher. I taught English and French, and I segued into history after having some questions about the present that made me want to look into the past. And so my experience with speaking, a lot of that happened in my family. My father was a pastor, so we got sermons all the time. It didn't matter the springboard for the sermon. It could be a salt shaker. It didn't matter. There was with 9 kids in the house. Also, you really had to learn how to stand and deliver pretty quickly. So that's a standing feature. In addition to just my general educational background, while I was an English teacher in the North Forest Independent School District, which is now part of the Houston Independent School District, I had a question in my mind as we were looking at literature. I was looking for a Black woman who was writing creatively in Texas. I didn't know of one at the time, and this was in 1990 to 1993. So that question was in the back of my mind while I was doing I hadn't actually begun to do historical research, but I was teaching literature and wanting to learn more about place, what was going on in Texas, what was going on in the United States, what was going on in whatever the novel was we were reading. So that historical understanding became really important to me. And so years later, I ended up finding the writings of Lillian Jones Horace. So I've republished her first novel and also her second novel. Chastity has done a lot of work in the Fort Bend ISD area. And I really, in addition to my meeting her at Texas Southern, we bumped into each other on a project with Dr. Andrew Torgett. And it was there that we realized when I was given the opportunity to present for Humanities Texas, I knew that I wanted Chastity to present with me because she worked on the Barbara Jordan project that you've probably already taken a look at. We sent that out. And Kamisha, again, she has done work. She's published a chapter recently in It's Our Movement Now. So this is how we're going to proceed. We are going to look at 3 major speeches by Barbara Jordan. And so Kamisha is going to provide the historical context. Chastity is going to talk about 7th and 11th grade history, and then I will focus on 11th grade ELA and civil discourse. And then we'll have a Q&A. We'll try to have a Q&A after each portion. So at this point, Kamisha is going to give us a broad overview of what's going on at the time that Jordan will be speaking. But the speeches that we're looking at, they span from 1974 to 1977. We already asked the group to look at the video, The Legacy of Barbara Jordan, which just gives us a brief bio of Barbara Jordan so that you would have some background if you're not familiar with her already. We also want you to take into account all of the different historical events, and this is just a few of the major ones, right? As we go through the discussion. And keep in mind also that we're talking about basically 1,213 days, right? 3 years, 3 months, 25 days in American history. So Kamisha, I'll yield the floor to you to give us historical background.
And actually, Dr. Kossie, if you could go back to the previous slide to just kind of give us a kind of a timeline. So when we think about Barbara Jordan, we know, of course, that Barbara Jordan, just her location, she's in Houston. Houston is a progressive city, or is definitely progressive. And she is a child of the civil rights movement. When we think about, 1950s, by that time, she is a young woman that's aware of what's going on locally, whether it be lunch counter sit-ins or and of course, those are happening on national levels as well. And she's attending Texas Southern University, a historically Black college, which has its own entrance in Black history, being that it was an institution that was established based on inequalities in public education and technically in higher education. So she's well aware of what's happening in that. This is 1950s, 1960s, right? These are these same individuals. And by the time we get to the 1960s, Jordan is coming into her own. She's graduated from Texas Southern. She's gone to law school. Late 60s, early 70s, we're thinking of the women's movement more. Some would call it second wave feminism, in which we see that rights have been granted to all. When we look at the Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Rights Act, even the role of those who are becoming citizens, based on the Hart-Celler Act of 1964, 1965. And so at this point, 1970s, we have Roe versus Wade. We have Jordan participating in technically Texas politics, in which she is supporting and endorsing legislation for equal treatment of women in employment. So we definitely see Jordan being a product of the changing currents around her. So, and of course, as we said, we're looking at these three speeches between 1974 to 1977. We see Jordan speaking to the nation as a citizen, as a fully recognized citizen at this point. And we also see her as an intersection of being a Black woman, right? So thinking about how all of that factors into these identities, and just some of this, definitely you can see that through her trajectory of speeches that she's starting to give, and even her legal actions that she's participating in, whether it's on a state level or whether it's on a national level that happens in the 1970s. And of course, we still see these impacts of Barbara Jordan years later. I remember being a school kid in the late 80s, early 90s, remembering Barbara Jordan, being a student council kid and thinking, oh my gosh, I want to have maybe I may think about a potential political career like Barbara Jordan. So we can definitely see how she is definitely having that type of impact.
All right, so now we're going to just think about some general issues that we want you to keep in mind as you're teaching or thinking about teaching her speeches: pedagogy, curriculum, and then just some general comments. So we'll be proceeding in the following manner. So we want you to think about foundational pedagogy and curriculum. Again, we're going to be looking at 7th and 11th grade history TEKS, 11th grade ELA TEKS. And in a general sense, all of you are probably familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. Of course, you will know how to adjust the lesson based on the group of students that you're teaching. So that's just a general foundational thing to keep in mind, like what level of learning you're trying to deal with when you're looking at a speech by Jordan. In terms of general comments, Chastity's going to share some general comments about 7th and 11th grade history teaching strategies.
Good evening, everyone. It's exciting to see some familiar faces from the Reconstruction webinar series. So good to have you here again tonight. I'm going to address Barbara Jordan from the social studies lens. We know that Barbara Jordan is specifically named in our 7th grade TEKS as an important individual. And I'll go back and touch upon some of the resources we have. But as far as high school and really getting down to the depth and the complexity when we analyze Barbara Jordan, she is not named specifically in the standards, right? And so I wanted to make sure that I provided you all with some standards to guide your lesson planning, because we know it's always important to associate your lessons with the curriculum standards. And so there are 3 specific points within the U.S. history TEKS that Barbara Jordan provides a great connection to, even though her name isn't named specifically. And her speeches really kind of support the student expectation of US 9I, which is obviously to evaluate changes in the US based on civil rights movement and political participation of minorities. We also have Citizenship US 23A, which is evaluate the contributions of significant political and social leaders. That one is important because that's a such as statement. And so it does name some individuals in that TEK, but it's a such as statement, which means you kind of have some breathing room to use other individuals who help you to support this student expectation. And there's, in my opinion, I'm biased. I think Barbara Jordan is a phenomenal person to include when getting students to evaluate the significance of leaders. And then there's culture, US 25A, which is explain the actions taken by people to expand economic and political opportunities and rights of different groups. And then obviously there's the contributions of women. And again, that's another such as statement. So although she is not named specifically in the standard, she's a great example when getting students to reach this level of thinking with the student expectation. So I wanted to drop that little nugget for those of you in high school who are like, well, Barbara Jordan isn't named in our standards. Where can she fit within the curriculum? Where can I weave it in? And I just wanted to make sure you had these on hand for lesson planning purposes down the road. Next slide, please. When we think about the U.S. history standards, I typically go to our skills standards when trying to help students make connections to person, places, and things that aren't named specifically in the standard. And so when we think about the skills strategies, there's several opportunities to get students to really deepen their understanding of historical analysis. And so these are just the real the umbrella skills, so to speak, of getting students to dig into the speeches of Barbara Jordan and really getting them to understand the historical context surrounding the time period where her speeches are being delivered and the cause and the effect. And so I wanted to make sure that you had the skills standards that tie into this as well. And then you'll see in the gray area are just a few strategies that correlate with those specific skills that you can then use to create lessons and examples. And I'm going to model a few of them, show you a few of them tonight that really kind of cross the line with these skills. Next slide. And then for those of you in Texas history, Dr. K and I worked with UNT in the portal of Texas history to establish this lesson on the life and legacy of Barbara Jordan. I can say this is probably one of my most favorite curriculum projects. Not only did we have Dr. Kossie giving us the voice and the video production, but the lesson really gives us an opportunity to dig into Barbara Jordan, the person. We have a subtle theme to that, and it's that it's separate but definitely superior. Like, so although she lived in a period of segregation, her life was superior, and her upbringing and her education and her training well prepared her to do the hard work that she did. We also have some nuggets of primary sources that are somewhat not easy to find. So I know that educators often have a hard time finding really rich primary sources. And so this lesson, you can access it. Dr. K put the link there for you. We can always drop it in the chat. I think it should be in also the resources that were sent, but I recommend you, even if you're teaching high school, dig into that lesson, pull it apart, because there's so many little hidden gems that you can use in your classroom to really get to understand who she was as a person. Phenomenal lesson. So I encourage you all to look at it.
Awesome. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to go over the background for rhetorical strategies and also just highlight the focus on civil discourse as well. Barbara Jordan is great for looking at that particular topic. So we want to consider Jordan's rhetorical universe, right? So what's in orbit? Race, gender, and citizenship. Of course, there are contemporary issues, some of which Kamisha has already highlighted. And then there's the issue of civil discourse. I found that when I looked over her speeches, regardless of what she's talking about in the speech, you sense someone who is committed to civil discourse. So if we have time at the end, we're going to look specifically at that topic, but I just want to put it out there so that we can think about it. Because we're talking about speeches, of course, her rhetorical situation is going to be significant. So we're thinking about purpose, audience, message, context and culture, and the writer. Now, when we think of politicians, we imagine that many of them, especially on a national level, they may have speech writers. Did Jordan have speech writers? Was she writing her own speeches? I think we know the answer to that. And Kamisha can talk to us about that aspect. But rhetorical strategies. We also want to keep in mind that Jordan had multiple audiences over the course of her really over the course of her life, and especially over the course of her political career. So this graphic is just basically here to have us think about the different audiences. We're focusing on 3, the House Judiciary Committee, those who attended the Democratic National Convention, and those who attend the Women's Convention. At the level of skills in English and language arts, the teacher is trying to make sure that the student understands that listening, speaking, reading, writing, and thinking are interconnected. They are also helping them to develop and sustain foundational language skills, comprehension skills. They're doing a lot. They're teaching them how to respond. They're looking at multiple genres. They're looking at the author's purpose and craft, composition, inquiry, and research. And then the overarching goals are academic oracy and also authentic reading and reflective writing. And this is just the same information presented in a different format. I'm a visual kind of person, so I love having graphics to help me pull all of this together. So there's an integrated, the goal is to show that these different things are integrated in what we do in English and language arts. When we're talking about speeches and rhetorical strategies, we realize that, the speech is first written. In most instances, it's going to be a prepared speech. And so the broader rhetorical strategies are going to be the same. There will be moments of analysis where they're looking at cause and effect. They may be comparing or contrasting, classifying and dividing, defining, explaining, narrating. These same broader strategies will be used in speeches as well. And then we will look at rhetorical strategies, some of the ones that you see highlighted, those are in red. You will see some of these in Jordan's speeches. And so as you're having the students look at rhetorical strategies, you can determine which you want to highlight when you're looking at Jordan's speeches. The other thing we think about as well when we're writing or speaking is when we're writing, we think about word count. I know I have to for presentations that I give. Barbara Jordan had to do the same thing, I'm sure. And also, when we're speaking, we're thinking about delivery and how long it's going to take us to say a certain thing. So I've given you the word count for each of the speeches, and we also have the time that she used to deliver them. So these are things that you'll have the students keep in mind. I'll also try to introduce one digital tool. Some of you, we all do text mining in one way or another, but how we can use text mining to have students visit with her speeches in visual ways and also in ways where we are looking at specific data in her speeches. When we look, we're going to spend a lot of time on the first speech with data mining, and the others will just show you products of or instances of text mining that we've used to analyze the speech. So we can use these text mining tools to appreciate the speeches. So let's begin. Let's start with our first speech. So Kamisha will give us a little specific historical background. Chastity will talk about the historical aspects, and then I will talk about rhetorical strategies.
Thank you, Dr. Kossie. So this speech is 1974. It's the Watergate hearings in which there's the accusation of President Nixon somewhat going into other offices. Well, not Nixon himself, but individuals affiliated with him are going into office suites. What's interesting to me is who Jordan mentions in this speech. One of the people that she mentioned is Daniel Ellsberg, who was known as the whistleblower. And just recently, within the past few years, he has actually given a majority of his papers to the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And with that, that's another way that you can think about these historical events. If they're mentioning other people, are their papers located in other places? Some of these are accessible. That way you can have students think about, oh, well, what were the actual documents? What were the first-hand accounts? I'm sure Chastity will give the how to do that on the school teacher level. But with this, Jordan, this is the first public appearance. This is a televised event in which Jordan really outlines what is the purpose, what's going to happen, and kind of what's expected. In that, she kind of also gives a lesson to citizens of what's expected. What are we supposed to demand? What are we supposed to ask? What are some of the rights that we have to inquire as citizens? So that's really one of the things that I get as a historian out of that. And to see in the primary sources, her narrated what has been given to the archives as far as what shows up in the teleprompter. What are some of the things that she's putting in her marginalia? Like, what is the research that's going into her giving this, what was considered a powerful speech, and her introduction to the country on a topic that was important?
When we're thinking about any speech, right, audience is important. So we want to keep that in mind as we look at each speech. Who is she addressing? In the Watergate speech, she's addressing the House Judiciary Committee. I'm sure Richard Nixon is somewhere around listening, and of course the nation, because this is televised. And again, in terms of length, it's not a very long speech, right? When we compare it to the one that she delivers at the Democratic National Convention. But this is the speech that sets the stage for the Barbara Jordan that everybody knows after that, right? It sets the stage for that. So this is why it's very important to sit with this one, I believe. It's foundational. Chastity?
Thank you. So from the social studies side of things, it's a phenomenal speech. It's a speech that students, by the time they get to high school U.S. history, should have some foundational understanding of some of the key things that she's talking about. So she's going to go to the preamble to the Constitution. She is going to speak to those as though they have some foundational understanding of the separation of powers and what the role of Congress is supposed to be and how that impacts the executive branch. And so students should have some background knowledge, which makes this speech, appropriate to do some of those commonly used social studies text analysis or primary source analysis strategies, whether it's a Stokes tone or an AP parts. This is a different approach. It's a 3-step process where you see that basic foundational who, what, when, where is like step 1, right? What is the information surrounding this speech? Step 2, Dr. Kossie will touch more on it in just a second. It's about that rhetorical effect, right? Like, what is the tone? What is the mood? How does she pace the address? And then all of those things are critically important to understand the effect, right? What is the effect? And so Kamisha mentioned it about how the whistleblower, his files are on file. This would have been a speech that kids, if their parents are of a certain age or their grandparents are still alive, would have vividly remembered because it was televised when people watched TV, right? Like it was like everybody turned on the news at 6 o'clock for dinner time. So this would have been televised and it would have been something, a hot topic, like the equivalent like TMZ today, right? And so when doing, when addressing this speech, I think you cannot address it without focusing on the impact and the effect. So there's 3 things we have to keep into perspective when getting kids to think about that: point of view, frame of reference, and perspective, right? And so in order to do that, kids have to be able to step outside of the present and go back into the past and think about the time period. She's not only speaking to an audience of people in chamber, but she's also speaking to the American public. So students have to say, okay, this is the year. What does the American public look like? What are they thinking? What are they experiencing at the time? And so these questions in the 3rd column really help students get to the heart of that. Now, I am not a fan these days. I would have 5 years ago when I was in classroom, 10 years ago, of assigning students roles. But what we can do is have them to think about what would be a perspective at the time. Who's watching this on the television? What would their mindset have been? And then what would their responses have been? And then you can put students in groups versus them having them analyze it on their own and get them to sort of, be provocative with one another and say, well, when we think about this positive or negatively, today I would say it was this, but if I were a so-and-so person living in so-and-so part of America, I may have felt this way, right? I'll show you one quick strategy and we'll move on. But this is quick and I don't, I have the same bag of tricks I've been traveling with for years. So some of you may have already seen this before or you can't really see it. I blocked my camera. It's called can of worms. And so when you have these provocative type questions, such as the ones in the 3rd row, go ahead and take a screenshot. That's what you want to do. I know you want to take a screenshot. It's okay. These are peanut cans. You can use like potato straw cans. These are little cans and we ate a whole bunch of peanuts and we put these provocative questions in the cans. And you put students in groups, 5 or 6, but especially when you have a speech with this type of depth, get the students to think about a perspective and a point of view or a frame of reference while they engage in these conversations. And then you set your discussion protocol. You pull a straw, 2 people have to respond with a different perspective, a different point of view to really get them thinking. You can use this for anything. It's just can of worms. Is those real high level, questions that really get kids to think about perspective and point of view in a non-threatening, safe kind of way that facilitates some civil discourse. So you can always follow back up and I'll share this, the can of worms.
All right, so here is an example of a word cloud generation of Barbara Jordan's speech. Has anyone ever used a word cloud generator? I'm looking for your answers in the chat. Yes. Okay, I like doing this because I like using the word cloud generator because it allows for students who are trying to enter a text that's kind of dense. It gives them a feeling of accomplishment to be able to drop something into a program and generate something visual. Okay, so it gives them another way to interact with the text, and it also gives them some important information. The first time I used a word cloud generator was when I was working on the Diary of Lillian Horace. So I dropped 175 pages of her diary, if that was the total, into a word cloud generator and was able to see what words were on her mind. And it was really a fascinating reveal. And we can see here, well, what was on Barbara Jordan's mind in this speech? The terms pop out right away, right? President, Constitution, impeachment. Okay, so it allows them to actually see what's going on. I did. Oh, great! They put it in the chat. The other thing we can think about too is the arc of the speech and what the underpinnings of the speech are. She is making a very logical argument here. So there's a lot of deductive reasoning happening in the speech. The other thing she brings to the table also is just her own personal educational background and her experience. And also she's carrying with her own history. She's carrying her history in this moment where she is calling their attention, those who are listening, she's calling her audience's attention to American history. She's referencing these very important political figures, right? It's almost like James Madison is in the room when she's talking, like she can actually, ask him to say something. She brings American history to life in that speech. And of course, the issue that they're talking about is related to ethics. And so one thing that we keep in mind with a speaker is how credible is the person that we're listening to? What emotions are they able to evoke as a result of who they are and what they're talking about? And then what in the speech helps us to believe what they are saying? Okay, and so one of the things that stands out about Jordan in this speech is the information that she brings to the text. Of course, the delivery is important as well, but all of these things help to make that speech the powerful speech that it is. Now, when we're thinking about a speech, it is a form of essay, but what we know is that the speech has a clear audience, and it also, we're imagining that audience is a live audience, right? With an essay, yeah, you have an audience, but it may not necessarily be a real-time audience, right? So the essay and speech generally they both require research, right? They both call on your ability to persuade, to inform, or to entertain. So if you've been having your students write, they've already begun to develop those skills that they will then use in a transferable manner as they analyze speeches and write them. Again, these rhetorical strategies are going to still be of use to them. If you've introduced them in writing, they will still be using them as they do their speeches, or write speeches or analyze speeches, and again, rhetorical devices as well. So we had you look at the speeches before we gathered, and I have some questions here, and one of them I want to have you answer since you've looked at the speeches. So look at the second question. It says, use the find option on MS Word to learn how many times Jordan used the pronoun we. Why do you think she used we as often as she did? Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop. Let's see, I want to do a new share of one of the speeches that I've already given you. And we're going to look at the find option here, and we're going to type in the word we. If you look to the left here, it gives us a number. What number do you see? Can you see that? The number 47. Why do you think she used the word we as extensively as she did in this speech? What's the impact of her doing so? I'll give you a minute to think about it and post something in the chat.
I thought she said it because, I mean, she references we the people, which I thought was amazing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I think she wanted to make feel everyone like, you know, this is something we should all be worried about. This is not a concern. This is not a, you know, uppity ups in the Congress concern. This is a we the people. Because she references Madison and what they wrote, what they put in the papers. So I think when she, you know, brings we in there, it's like, okay, we as a group need to consider that.
Unity, yes. And someone typed, Robin mentioned unity, that she's connecting all. Yes, we is relational, exactly. It creates a team. So your students could do this, right? You could let them look at an MS Word version of the speech, okay? And they can, you know, because they're learning how to use this digital tool, right? And then they're also using it in an analytical way that makes sense for their ability to understand the speech, okay? The other thing that you noticed in her speech is you could ask a question about rhetorical strategies. One of the ones that you noticed, because I've looked at the speech, the phrase "did know." A rhetorical strategy that she uses a lot is repetition, right? Look at the word evidence. I've highlighted words that she's used. Why is repetition important in this speech? Why do you think we've talked about the we? What about phrases that are repeated? In particular, the phrase "we know." What does that do?
I just love that she used the word petty because our students use it all the time. I don't think they have any idea exactly what it means, but I love how she just put it out there. You know, this is not petty. This is not us being, you know, silly about parties. It's a big deal. So I did love that she used the word petty more than once too. So just wanted to put that in there.
Thank you. We know, yeah, we know means that this is truth. It is something we all agree to. Yeah, it also says that we share knowledge, right? We have she's pulling her group together also with that phrase. Like, yes, repeated phrases and speeches are callbacks. Great. Create a list in a convention speech. They usually create a call and repeat to unify the audience. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so repetition is one that she uses effectively in this speech. Allusions is another that she uses, right? She alludes to the Constitution. She alludes to Hamilton. She alludes to the framers, right? So she's calling on history. Chastity mentioned that the students will, at this point, they will be studying American history, right? And so this may be a good this may be an opportunity for a good collaborative lesson plan with a history teacher, right? If you're looking at Jordan's speech. Kamisha?
So this is 1976, right? We're at the nation's bicentennial. Now, of course, you know, she gives this Watergate speech in 74, and I think that may have been something that she was thinking about as well, like she's thinking in the future. One of the things that really sticks out to me in this speech is that she says that I, Barbara Jordan, am giving a keynote address, right? 200 years after the founding of the country, this is possible. And she really asks the party, but she also uses it kind of as a unifying call in this period. So, and of course, you know, Jordan comes back and speaks roughly about 20 years later in the 1990s, the DNC. But once again, the 76th speech, once again, put Barbara Jordan on the national stage. When reading her biographies, when reading some of the coverage in media like the New York Times, they really talk about how Jordan really outlines what she wants us to do as a party, as a country. And so that's one of the beautiful things, I think, about this particular speech. Just all the rhetoric that goes around it, everything leading up to, the whole playing of the Stars at Night, to introduce Barbara Jordan to the stage, all those things that we need to think about. And this particular speech, let me make sure. So the woman that's on my other side, this is Bella Abzug. So if you look at some of the video coverage, she's attending this 1976 convention. So when you see her at the end, it pans to her and she's looking and she's reacting like the rest of the audience in awe. And in some of her correspondence, when the 77 conference in Houston happens, this is one of the things that Bella talks about. Like, I recall your speech at the DNC. And of course, we will want you to give a speech in 77 in your hometown.
With this speech, she's speaking to the Democratic National Convention, right? And of course, we have television, so she's speaking to the entire nation. At this, she has made her mark through the Watergate hearings, and so Barbara's there, and folks are waiting to hear what she has to say. This is the longer of the three speeches. Cassidy is going to talk about primary source strategies for interpretation.
Thank you. So as you saw, this is the longer of the three speeches, coming in at about 20 minutes if you watch the video, right? I would ask a question, but it would be almost rhetorical. How many of you have the time to commit to, projecting a 20-minute speech and then having students analyze it, right? Anybody in here would be able to squeeze that in and really build it out into a full-blown lesson? If you're in here, I would love to know who you are. I see Janice's face. Janice is like, I don't think so, right? And so when we think about using a speech like this in a classroom set after STAR, yes, Kathy, you win the award. You win the award. When we think about a speech that has as much content packed into it, she's hitting some major key points, but the length of it, the key strategy I want us to think about is chunking. How can we chunk a speech like this into smaller bits so that students have some opportunity to engage with it and have those big takeaways? A 90-minute block, I can do it. There just isn't time covering the curriculum, right? We all have that scope and sequence or that pacing guide we have to stick to. So one of the things that I like to do when we have longer text sets and or a speech such as this, for this particular speech, you've got to show about the first minute and a half. You have to hear her say, I, Barbara Jordan. Like, if you don't show that, you've done a total disservice, right? So I would show the first minute and a half to get kids sort of engaged and interested to know who she is and what the setting, again, the setting is appropriate, who she's talking to. And then what I would do is go straight to the transcription of that speech. Now, this is just me suggesting, right? If you don't have time to show the full video and then unpack it. You can go to the transcription of the speech and then again, I love putting kids in groups when we're analyzing text, heavy text, right? Because there's going to be different reading levels and different opportunities for them to share. We make assumptions a lot of times that our kids know how to dig in and read and draw a conclusion. And then many times, even by the time we get to 11th grade, that's a major struggle. And so this is a strategy, we call it analyzing. And it's not just a matter of annotating, which is writing in the margins or putting question marks, and highlighting, which if you give any student that I currently work with a highlighter, it becomes a coloring sheet, right? This is strategic in that when you put the students in groups, Each person in the group gets a different highlighter and our post-it note if you don't want it to bleed through, right? So each person, if you have a group of 4, you're gonna give a yellow, a pink, a green, and a blue highlighter or set of post-it notes. And then they're gonna each get a page or a section. And this is the opportunity for you as the teacher to review the transcription or review the video and pick certain markers on the speech to then assign to students. They read their section, they annotate, which is again, right in the margins, underline, point out keywords, and then they highlight a few key things, but it's whatever they highlight, and you can set the parameter. I put 2 to 3 key points per section. Whatever they highlight, they then have to then go a step further, whether it's summarizing what they read, identifying the main idea, or even writing it in a simple language for another group member. This is a great way if you have like English language learners or students who have, difficulty with interpreting text. By the time they get to that particular part of the text, someone has simplified and brought the Lexile level down of the document. So you set a timer. Each person has a finite amount of time to annotate and highlight for their peer, and then they pass that section until each person in the group has had a chance to interact with the entire primary source set that you've extracted, right? It's highly effective. Again, it's a way, we call it, whether it's sheltering instruction for your English language learners or providing a way for students who may be a little more reluctant to do the reading strategies on their own, to really get engaged with them all, to have a touch point with such a powerful, powerful speech that I think students would find very interesting. Thank you.
Robert mentioned, he said he could do it, but there isn't time between covering curriculum and then senior finals. Yeah. Our word cloud generator gets us right to the heart of her speech, the words that are most important. Clearly, she is referencing, she's talking to the people. Now, we could do the same kind of text mining exercise that I did with the Watergate speech, right? You could do the same thing here, all right? The other thing I would like to have you think about also in a different way is having the automated voice in Microsoft Word read the speech. Okay, that's another thing that you can do. And it gives the students, again, another way to interact with the text. And also to compare Jordan's delivery of the speech with that of an automated voice. Okay, so in the interest of time, I won't do that. But here are rhetorical, one thing that you can ask about this speech: how many rhetorical questions did she ask? I noticed that in this speech, she asked a lot of questions. Why was this an effective strategy in this speech? Using rhetorical questions. If I can have some answers from the audience. Why do rhetorical questions work?
Because everyone's going to have a different answer.
Yeah.
So there's no wrong answer, basically. So it's making people feel like they're involved, like she's listening, like she's asking these questions and looking for feedback from the audience. And so people feel like they're part of, this, when she's talking about the DNC and us and we, and look at where we're at and democracy and everything else. When she asks those rhetorical questions, people can respond and feel like they're in the speech with her, not just listening to her talk at them.
Exactly. And they also are being made to think really about what they hope to achieve as a party. So at this point, do you have any questions for us before we go on to the next speech? Just want to have a pause for any questions.
Was she opposed at all? I mean, an African-American woman in Texas in the 70s, she was facing many, many hills. I mean, were her elections, I never saw her like election results. Were they close? I know that the first 2 times she did in fact not win. And so the third time did she win? Was there a reason why that third time she kind of got over the ignorance and racism?
You know, I don't even know if it was okay. By the third speech, she has the support of a whole lot of folks, because at this point, her name is there's more name recognition. One thing I definitely learned from running for political office once was that just having your name out there is very important. So she lost the first two times, but what is also happening is that more and more people know who she is. So it wasn't only an issue of race, but rather one of name recognition as well. And Kamisha, maybe you can add something to that.
Well, yeah, I mean, by the time we get to that point, we see Jordan really thinking about like national issues, right? She is supporting of the Equal Rights Amendment, right? So that definitely, puts her on the, okay, I can, she's having more of a broader audience, more broader acceptance by the time we get to Jesus. And you can see that like in her legislative career, that she's really starting to be more inclusive in thinking about that. So, and there was a little bit of distance from Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Yeah.
So there's that to think about as well, because initially, it was definitely, she had a lot of endorsements and support from Lyndon Baines Johnson.
All right, so we're ready for speech number 3, the 1977 Women's Convention.
So the 77 Women's Convention. So it started out as the International Year of Women, in which we're starting to think more about women's rights. Like I said, Jordan is doing things like passing Texas Senate Bill 13, which looks at things like fair employment practices, right? So that's happening. And so President Carter starting to really think about, well, what should we do about women? So this becomes a national and an international initiative, and they decided Bella Abzug, the woman who I'm hiding, is spearheading this, and she, once again, it's Houston, and who better than Barbara Jordan, who this is her hometown, to deliver the keynote address. Houston is once again being considered a progressive era, a progressive city, for it to be hosted. And I think it's really interesting when we see what happened in the 77 convention. We have the 77 Women's Convention held downtown, and you have Phyllis Schlafly literally having her own gathering at what was formerly, I believe, the Astrodome. So literally within roughly a 10-mile radius, you have these two dividing views of women's rights and women's views. So I think that's definitely something to think about. But once again, it was the fact that Abzug had been watching Barbara speak on these national stages. And who better than someone who's been on a national stage to speak at home?
Awesome. Well, someone mentioned in the chat, when running for Congress, she was in a district carved up to elect her. Yeah. And yeah, so it was created with her in mind, and you're absolutely right. Yes. So for this, the speech at the Women's Convention, again, we know whom she's speaking to. She's there for the convention or the women's conference, and it's also televised. So her audience is they know who Barbara Jordan is at this point, and they're wanting her to, they're wanting to hear what she has to say with regards to women and where they are. Just waiting for this to respond. Okay. This was the shortest of the 3 speeches, only 4 minutes and 50 seconds. Chastity?
Awesome, thank you. This is the shortest speech, but I feel like this speech has been put in the spin cycle. It is just like the topics that she's talking about are still relevant in this very present moment. And so I really, when getting students to read primary sources or watch videos of speeches that have real relevant, real life connections, present day connections, you have to capitalize on that, right? And so this is one strategy from the Library of Congress. It's called Observe, Reflect, and Question. Similarly, I use a strategy with visuals. If you participated in the Reconstruction web series, I see, I know, I wonder, and they're kind of very similar in that for this strategy, students will watch the video and jot down clear observations. What do they see instead? Like, what is obvious in the observation? Then get them to reflect on some of the key points that were made, some of the key thoughts, and then what questions might they have about whether it's how people received it, where did this idea came from, what prompted her to say certain things. Get them to jot down those questions. And then those questions are then used for further investigation. And the further investigation could be the teacher presentation, the lecture, the text reading, the secondary source that the student will then read to figure it out, to figure out the answers to those questions. I also like a strategy, I'll drop it in the chat. When thinking about this particular topic, and I actually listened to it again earlier today, and I was like, oh, well, I wish I would have suggested this strategy. It's called What, So What, and then Now What, right? And so when you think about what, so what, and now what is like, what is she talking about? What point is she trying to make? The so what is what was the impact? What was the significance? So what was the big deal about it? The now what is when you're really wanting students to make past to present connections. Now what about, like, now what? How did it impact today? What are we still seeing today that we can draw back, and whether it's make an analogy, make a connection? When we're thinking about chronological reasoning and how events from the past impact the present, right? This is a great opportunity to get students to really dissect this speech and make some connections to arguments and things that they're presently seeing, whether they don't really watch the news too much, but they know a lot more than what we know, we think they know. And so this is just another little strategy, whether you use it as an engage technique or a hook strategy. I think it's something that you might find valuable.
Okay. And again, the word cloud gets right at the heart of what's in her speech, what her concerns are, right? She's talking to women, and look at some of these words: goals, human rights, legislation, okay, all of that. So here's the question for this one. Which rhetorical device did Jordan use twice in the introduction of her speech?
We were discussing the comparison of women, I believe, like the type of women that she was using. I think in
the first paragraph, she alludes to the Proverbs woman, right?
Yes, the going from virtue.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, she alludes to the Proverbs woman. And what else does she do? Anybody happen to have the speech in front of them? Let me see if I may have it right here. Let's see if it's here. I don't want to look for it. Well, she makes an allusion to the Proverbs woman, and she also makes sure that she transitions from her discussion about virtue to power, right? Right. That was the other important thing that we wanted to remember, that she moves from virtue to power. She also makes an allusion to, in the first line, to Harper's Magazine. So this is one of those instances where you're on the historical end, you're helping the students to understand what women might have been reading, right? So she makes a reference to a periodical that she thinks the students should know about. There's also the reference to the Bionic Woman and to Wonder Woman. Now, students may have heard of Wonder Woman. I'm not sure if they've heard of the Bionic Woman, but you may have to do a trip down memory lane to help them understand what folks would have been watching on television, right? What they would have been familiar with. Any questions in particular for about this speech that you have? Now, I do want to point out that at the end of this speech, and I didn't realize it until I did the text mining on this speech, that when she's giving the speech, she asks a rhetorical question, right? But that rhetorical question was not in the written speech. So this is one of those moments where we see her doing something instantaneous and extemporaneous, okay? So it wasn't in the written text, but she adds it. What will you reap? What will you sow? And it's very powerful at the end of that speech. So that's one of the things that the speaker gets to do. They can kind of go off, they can go off the script if they choose to. And I think she read the moment and understood that I can ask yet another couple of questions that will leave my audience thinking and appreciating what I've had them think about.
As far as her speeches, and so I teach 7th grade, and so I've got real high and real low kiddos and the whole thing. Do you have any issues like trying to explain what some words mean? Like at the end of that one, where will you reap? What will you sow? I have to explain what reap and sow mean. Just like when we just been talking about the Great Depression and the run on the banks. I had to explain what a bank failure meant, and I, referenced Silicon Valley because it just happened. But do you have even with the transcripts in front of them, do they have a hard time understanding some of the words that she's using? I mean, should we do like a vocab list before we show that speech, or?
You will know the level of your students, right? And so for 7th grade, Chastity can speak more to that than I can, but I would say that with any level of students that you're teaching, you'll kind of know where they are and how much foregrounding they're going to need to appreciate a speech like this, right? So that's where, you're determining what you think you want them to get out of it. And that's why for a group like that, using text mining allows them to feel some level of success just by seeing what the main thoughts are in the speech, right? And so they can feel comfortable knowing, well, I have this idea, and then they can sort of gradually, learn the others. So you could give them a list on the side, just as you've already alluded to, things that you think they may not know. You can have them look it up, and this is not something, I don't know how you would set this up, but it's not something that you would have to do in a day, right? You could study a speech like this over a couple of weeks if you wanted to. But to help them, I'm saying, you can have exercises on it, right? Over a period of time and say, well, we're going to keep looking at this speech. We have these other things, but we're going to really know this speech by the end of the month, So I think you could do it sort of, it could be a foundational exercise for where you're teaching certain kinds of whether it's rhetorical techniques, whether you're focusing on allusions, you can pick the one that she's used the most, whether you're focusing on rhetorical questions, right? You can sort of let that be the foundational thing that you focus on. Because sometimes you can't do everything, right? But you choose to do something with a given speech. I want somebody to clarify for me the time. I know that it's 6:14. Do we have 15 more minutes?
Yes, we have until 6:30.
Okay, great. So now we're thinking about the speech as a speech writing. Okay. So what distinguishes a speech from an essay? Get some ideas in your head, and we'll just go down a list. a speech is performed, it's staged, it's presented, right? Body language, posture, stance, and hand gestures, intonation, pronunciation, enunciation, and breathing. All of those are important. It's delivered in real time before a live or a virtual audience, right? So this is where the kids are having to think about being engaged physically in the process, right? There are different kinds of speeches. Of course, you can make them aware of. So whether you're giving a speech to entertain or inform is going to determine a whole lot, right? Like the examples that you use, the words that you use, the information that's contained in it. So just having them think about the different kinds of speeches is important. Again, thinking about the rhetorical situation. And also, one of the things we think about with speeches is that you can be writing a speech that you will deliver, or you can be writing a speech that someone else will deliver, okay? So if you're writing a speech that someone else will deliver, that's another level of understanding and observation, right? And why is that? Why is writing a speech that someone else will deliver, why is that requiring another level of observation and analysis?
I think you've got to take their own speaking style into account, and you have to kind of include them in writing. When you're just writing a speech, you can just go after the ideas and you don't have to worry about the personalities.
Yeah. Right. So you're having to think about how would this person say it, right? And this is something that 11th graders may be able to do. For example, you could ask them, you know, if your mother was giving a speech, right? Because they're going to know their mom, somebody that they know really well. What might a speech that she gave on a particular topic, what might she stress and how might she phrase certain things, right? So if you're having them do an exercise where they're writing for someone else, you would want to take someone else, that you have them pick someone whom they know very well, right? Or if they knew a little brother or sister was going to give a speech, right? Or a neighbor or someone that they spend a lot of time with, that would be an approach there. I mentioned to Kamisha that when I was in high school, I was actually valedictorian of my class, and I wrote both my speech and I wrote the speech of the salutatorian. And what was fun was, you know, I had people telling me that the salutatorian speech was better. And I said, oh, good. No problem. I've written both of them. So if you're looking at looking for activities for 11th graders, these are some that you can consider. You can have the students read poetry aloud in small groups. They can advance to larger groups because some students really will be, they really may be afraid and they need some time to feel comfortable doing so. They can read famous monologues, right? They can read and watch famous speeches. You can have students write and give how-to presentations. You can also have them do mock trials. This, you know, in a history course or in an ELA course. And then, of course, you can use digital tools to practice. They can practice on their phones. Someone earlier mentioned they're practicing on a PowerPoint. They can practice on Zoom. Okay. Any questions or comments at this point? Okay, so this is what I'm calling our bonus portion of it. And this is where we can use Jordan also to teach civil discourse to history students and ELA students. There's a lot of, you know, we hear a lot of talk now, and in our in the digital age, how to communicate and the kind of communication. There's all kinds of communication out there, and a lot of it isn't civil. And so Jordan exemplified and demonstrated something that I think in today's world we've kind of lost and need to regain, right? So what is civil discourse? And I just want to look at what it is and what it isn't. And this information I got from the National Council for Social Studies. Civil discourse is a conversation in which there is a mutual airing of views. It is not a competition. It is intended to promote mutual understanding. It does not mean behaving like Mr. or Miss Manners. It follows rules. It follows general rules of polite behavior. It does not make personal. It does not make it personal or attack the other individual personally and his or her views. It uses logic, persuasion, evidence, information, and argumentation to make a point or defend a position. Okay, and so there are other ways that you can look at civil discourse. It's truthful, it's productive, it's audience-based. It's about listening and talking. Each speaker's own responsibility is to contribute to this civil way of communicating. It's not merely politeness, excuse me. It's not an exercise in martyrdom. It's not about telling other people who they are. It is not purely performative. So when we look at Jordan, she was clearly committed to civil discourse. So you can have the students cite at least one example of how her commitment, in the content and delivery of the speeches. Okay, so you can look at the text and try to find examples of her demonstrating a commitment to civil discourse. And then you can watch the video. How is she behaving as she stands at the podium? Okay, how is she addressing her audience in these spaces? So you can have them think about the speeches in this way as well. I do have some handouts that I can share that you can share with your students. Civil discourse, a self-reflection. There's a discussion starter. You can also set ground rules for civil discourse if they're doing a mock trial or discussion. And then there's also a rubric that you can use for evaluating student presentations where they are being asked to think about civil discourse. Okay. So our last discussion will be about sources. Okay. Sources are absolutely important to what we do, and we're going to focus on sources that are important when you're looking at Barbara Jordan. History happens in a place, right? So wherever that place is, there's going to be some kind of evidence of what happened in that space. So these are some of the places where you can find information about Jordan: the Barbara Jordan Archives at Texas Southern, the University of North Texas, the Texas State Archive, Congressional Archive, National Archive, and so on. So even making the students aware, I think it's important to introduce them to doing research online and helping them to understand how to find credible sources, where to find credible sources, and teaching them how to use them. So we have a lot at our fingertips now. We can just click and go and look at her speeches, just as I sent video links to you so that you could look at archival. All of this is archival material. But I think as teachers, we have to help them understand how to make sure our sources are legitimate. Okay.